Keir Starmer, welcome. Thank you for doing this. It's very good to see you.
Thank you for having me on.
In Davos, of all places. How do you find it? Extraordinary place, isn't it?
It is an extraordinary place, and my first time. So we arrived yesterday, and it's been absolutely full-on busy, incredible intensity, and very, very good to be here. I mean,
so give me a flavour of the conversations you've been having.
Well, we've been talking to CEOs, international CEOs of Lloyd's, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, you name it, and there's a strong sense of anxiety about where the UK is, and sort of recognising that a decade or so ago the UK was a leader, was always looked to, and now what they're saying to me is, look, in the conversations they're having here, the UK is either not being mentioned, which is a real cause for concern, or if mentioned, the question is coming up, well, why invest in the UK? And that I think shows the extent of the sort of brand damage that has been done in recent years, and this sense of drift, no plan, instability, particularly in the last couple of years, and a real, there's investment to be made in the UK, but it's not being made in the UK, and that's, there's a sense of urgency that things need to change. Is this the
Labour Party leader kind of interpreting that, or is that really the flavour of what people were saying to you?
This is the flavour, and I mean, you've been here for a couple of days now. I'm sure you will have picked it up, and you can see it actually reflected in the numbers. If you look at foreign direct investment into the UK, 8% under the last Labour government, 4% in the last 13 years. So it's borne out by the figures. This is, yes, it's party political, I get that. This is not good for the UK. I used to represent the UK in one of the institutions in the EU to deal with criminal justice 10 years ago when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, and 28 countries sitting around a table, any issue, ask the UK first. Now, wherever I go, there's a sense of what's happened, almost put your arm around the UK. This is not, I don't care which political party you're in, you should not want your country to be treated and to be thought of in this way. I'd actually, yes, it's a party political issue because this is a statement of intent in being here in terms of where the next Labour government will be and restoring this and reversing it. But actually, whether you're Labour, Conservative or any other party, you should not want your country to be a country where people are looking and saying, what happened?
And what happened? Because you're talking to us about these, companies putting their arms round us, a sense almost of pity, a worry about investment. Aren't they asking you what the post-Brexit plan is, quite simply?
Yeah, they want to know the answer to some pretty basic questions. And being here answers one of those questions because there's been a sense they have of the UK retreating from the sort of global stage. Not being at the table. And the fact that the Prime Minister isn't here is further evidence of that. So by being here, it's a statement of intent. Yes, you're here. You're giving us a strong sense that this matters to an incoming Labour government. You want to be on the international stage. What is the plan for the future? I've been talking this morning intensively with CEOs about green power and where we go with the race towards renewables and the energy crisis, and there's a global race on, and other countries are in that race. And where are we in that race? We began to set out our plan at conference of last year. We're developing that plan for clean power generation by 2030. That's a tough ask, but we can do it in partnership with business. They're up for that discussion. And one of the things that I want to do is to make sure that we're using these months, particularly in 2023, to have those in-depth discussions with CEOs, to tell them what our intent is, to work through a way of working to make sure that when we come into government, we really can hit the ground running.
Let's spell it out, because when you look at it, we have the lowest growth in the G7, we have the worst economic recovery post-pandemic. Will you articulate that is predominantly, majorly Brexit, because we left the EU with no real plan for trade? We're saying the word, you're not.
Well, Brexit is a contributing factor. There's no doubt about that. And that's why I've been clear here and previously that we need a closer and better trading relationship with the EU. But I would actually say, look, low growth has been a feature of the last 13 years, not just the post-2016 years, which have made a bad situation worse. And amongst the things that have come up in conversation in the last 24 hours here are, of course, the fact that we went through 3 prime ministers and 4 chancellors last year. For investors, big investors, you've got the world's greatest investors here. That sort of instability is a factor that makes them much more cautious about investing in the UK. So yes, there's Brexit, but there are other factors as well. And I think we've got a sense that this government just doesn't have a plan. It doesn't know where it's going.
But Europe is our biggest single market.
Yeah.
Always has been, since we've been part of the single market. If I ask you, is Labour going to take us back into the single market, you'll say no. But do you hope...
Will you?
No, we won't go back into the single market, but we do need a closer trading relationship.
So what does that mean? If there's been 5 years, the election's next year and there's been 5 years of a Labour government, and it's 2028, will we be having frictionless trade where we have got regulatory alignment with the European Union?
Well, look, I think it goes in stages, and I'm well aware of and cautionary about politicians in front of a microphone saying we're going to get this, that and the other, because this is a negotiation. But it starts...
What's the aim?
The aim is a much closer trading relationship. We know that Europe is our biggest trading partner. We know that barriers to trade are a problem. The deal we've got isn't working, and we need to reduce the friction in this, reduce the barriers. The first thing is the protocol. And everybody asks me about the protocol, whichever country in Europe they come from. Not because they're necessarily across the details of what needs to happen to get goods across the water from GB to Northern Ireland, because it's a litmus test. It's a test of how serious you are about a better relationship with the EU. So the first issue is to deal with the protocol, which is why I was in Belfast last week talking about what we do on the protocol.
And assuming that gets sorted, and
Yeah.
I know that's a huge assumption, I still want you to paint that picture for me. You're saying we want much closer trading relations. I want to know whether you think there will be a kind of deal done a la Norway, a la Switzerland, where we are now. And I know they've each got their own bespoke deals and they've each got their drawbacks. But whether there is a deal whereby Britain can trade without the complexity that there now is. And
Without friction at all.
Friction.
Well, certainly we can reduce barriers and significantly reduce barriers to trade. Now, I went to, when I was, for my sins, I was the shadow Brexit secretary for 3 years. I went to Norway, I went to Switzerland for 4 days each and looked at their arrangements and came away thinking we wouldn't do that. And actually they said to us, you wouldn't do this. I mean, Switzerland, for example, has had to amend their basic deal with the EU 200 times.
Okay, what do
They're
you
in
mean?
constant negotiation.
What
So
do you
it
mean
need-
for your sins? I mean, I know it's a turn of phrase, but do you mean you wish you'd never been the shadow Brexit secretary, or do you mean it was just bloody awful?
It was really awful. We had 3 years. There was a vote to leave the EU and no plan as to what that really means. And those 3 years were a government, flailing around trying to get a plan. We're in opposition. I'm trying to be as clear as I can about what our position would be. And I wanted to understand how Switzerland and Norway worked.
And I want to
many people are saying, well, that's a model to adopt. No is the answer to that, but they are bespoke models, and in the end, whatever is done will be a bespoke model.
What I'm trying to understand is your ambition. What I'm trying to understand is, there are going to be fewer barriers. We want a better trading relationship. That's taken. No one's going to say we want worse trading relations. I want to know what the ambition is, what Prime Minister Starmer hopes he will achieve.
Well, I think that by being really clear about issues such as the standards that we would adhere to, we go a long way to removing the barriers. So there are...
You'd keep European standards.
Look, high standards are something which the
aligned
UK...
not just high, but aligned with what Europe does.
Yeah, high, but the first thing is to say high standards, because there are high standards in Europe. Most of them, or many of them, came from the UK. We have been a country of high standards for a very, very long time. I think it's very important for a Labour government to be clear as we go to the election, and obviously the other side of the election, that we would maintain those high standards, because the tension, You can see it in the protocol, but it's there with the deal. The tension is where there's divergence. Obviously, when it comes to how do you make sure that you maintain high standards, there's a discussion to be had about the mechanism. And I don't want to get ahead of myself because that is a discussion that is a two-way discussion. But the first thing is to be clear that we wouldn't be a government that wants to deregulate lower standards because that is fundamentally at odds with the approach we'd take as a Labour government.
And on the other side,
but there are other areas where we can work more closely. On security, the last 12 months, because of the awful position in Ukraine, there's been a maturing discussion about the way NATO and the EU would work differently together, and the UK as a leading member of NATO within that. So a discussion to be had about that. Science and technology and research as well.
you would never make the case for rejoining the EU as Prime Minister, is that right?
I don't think there is a case for rejoining the EU or the single market. And when
economically or politically?
Politically.
But economically there is.
Look, politically, I mean, in the world of politics, having had the referendum, having gone through what we went through, then there's no political case for rejoining.
Can I ask
I
you
also would say this, that, I mean, particularly reflecting on everything that's been said to me this morning, amongst the problems with investment is that since 2016 there has been chaos and no plan and no certainty. And investment never thrives in those circumstances.
But that's all tied in.
So
I mean,
the idea that we would
it?
then reopen that and have, I don't know, 5 years or more of new negotiations would just add to the uncertainty. And
So
that's why
Keir
a
Starmer
closer
will never
trading
make
relationship-
the case for rejoining the EU.
No, there isn't a case for rejoining the EU or the single market. And in the discussions I'm having with European leaders, there's an assumption by some people outside the room that the discussion is you've got to join the single market. That isn't the discussion we're having. The discussion is a different discussion about how we trade better together.
What do you say to the Tony Blairs, the Peter Mandelsons, who say, look, you've got this 20-point lead. You can afford to be a little bit bolder over Europe, because I feel that you are frightened of the politics. That's what it sounds like. You were on the wrong side of the argument in the 2016 referendum, and you want to move Labour to a position where the red wall seats, no one's going to say, oh, Labour, they just want to take us back into the EU.
You've adopted the slogan, you're taking back control.
The slogan and take back control is really important to what we're doing. And obviously, everybody knows I campaigned for Remain. I voted for Remain. And made the argument for Remain. But the take back control, I felt, was bigger than the question of membership of the EU, because that slogan was successful because it was a Heineken phrase. It got into people. And when people ask themselves, do I have enough control?
Well, it wasn't a Heineken phrase. It was a Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson phrase, wasn't it?
Sure, but it got into people. And if you ask people, have you got enough control? If you can't manage your household budget because you haven't got enough money coming in, you don't have control.
But to
if
John's
you can't
point,
send your children to a decent school, you don't have control. If you feel you can't go out after dark because of antisocial behaviour, you don't have enough control. I always felt there was another side of Brexit, if you like, which was a very powerful cry for change, which went way beyond the question of membership of the EU. And that's never been addressed. And when I say take back control bill, it is answering that question as to how we empower communities who feel very remote from politics and influence just at the moment. And nothing has happened in the 6 years to answer that plea for change.
But to John's point, is there a boldness in your vision with Europe? I mean, we know Tony Blair has said on our podcast, on the newsagents, there has to be more boldness, more bravery in actually what you're talking about with Europe now.
Well, if you look at boldness, I mean, we've set out what we want to achieve with Europe, but there's much, much more to it than that. Our economy hasn't grown for 13 years. We haven't had a strategic plan for 13 years. I've been talking to CEOs who are talking about what we can do in our position outside of the EU. When we're talking about clean power generation by 2030, CEOs of energy companies, of finance companies, financial services are really interested in that. What does that look like? What's the partnership? How do we hit it by 2030? They're not saying to me, but you can't if you're not in the EU. They're saying you can if you've got a strategic plan, you work with us, you can trigger the investment that is there through a partnership of public investment, of course, and private investment as well.
And just on economic growth, which you say has been so sort of slovenly for so many years, one thing that could help enormously is to relax immigration rules, because there are labour shortages across the UK economy.
Well, that's been what we've always done, and we've always carried with it a skills problem. So before I was the shadow Brexit secretary, I was the shadow immigration secretary, and I went round the country talking to business about immigration, and wherever I went, whatever the size of the business, whatever they were doing, the discussion became one about skills. And the absolute failure of skills in this country. And so the idea that the only way to deal with that is to necessarily ramp
one
up.
way.
We will always need immigration, of course we will, and welcome it too. But we also have to face the fact that one of the drivers of immigration is that we haven't got a decent skills strategy in this country. And equally, one of the things that Jonathan Ashworth has been tackling, we've got 2.5 million people who are out of the labour market just at the moment, particularly the over 50s. And we need to have a plan and a strategy for getting them back into the labour market.
So no new visas then for people who want to come to this country to work to solve the labour shortages problem?
Well, we will always want people to come to work. And of course, if you're pro-business, you don't shut that off and damage the economy. But one of the things I said in my New Year's speech just a few weeks ago was that I think one of the fundamental challenges of the last 10, 13 years in this country is we just do sticking plaster politics. We don't really fix the long term, we just fix the short term. And more visas, yes, that fixes things in the short term, and I'm not against it because we need to ensure that we don't do further economic damage, but it's not a long-term solution.
Can I change the subject now, which is on what has been unfolding this week over in Scotland, bringing in the gender recognition bill and the government blocking it, saying that there are problems with that. Would you repeal that if you were in power?
Repeal?
Well, would you allow the Scottish legislation to be enacted?
Well, my starting position is that I think there are two political footballs being kicked around at the moment. There's the SNP kicking around a devolution football, and there's the government kicking around a gender recognition football. The way that the devolution settlement was intended to operate was that in the event of conflict, both sides got around a table and resolved it. And that's the approach that we would take if we were in government. In other words, let's look at where there are constitutional devolution issues with the bill that's been passed and see whether they can be resolved. And that's the approach we would take in government.
And you say the government is kicking it around as a political football, but you agreed, I think, that the age of 16 was too young for gender self-identification.
Yeah, I do have concerns about that. I've been clear about that. I do have concerns about the impact on the Equalities Act. Now, they are the very issues that need to be discussed.
So the government aren't kicking
about.
it around as a political football. They're wrestling with the same issues that you are.
Well, I have no doubt that one of the motivators for the government is to try to create what they call a wedge issue on this and to divide and make politics difficult across the chamber.
So take the politics out of it then. You've said you were concerned about lowering the age to 16. If it stayed at 18 but didn't require medical diagnosis, would Labour sign that off? Would you be happy with that?
We want to modernise the Gender Recognition Act that we have here, and we are looking at various proposals to do that. What I wouldn't do is tie myself to the SNP model. We will come up with our own proposals.
But I've given you one that's nothing to do with the SNP. If it was 18 but didn't require a medical diagnosis.
Yeah, we want to modernise. We are discussing that. We're consulting on that. And when we've arrived at a final position, we will then set that out. But at the moment, we're having discussions about that. And I want to have discussions in a respectful, tolerant way, which is the opposite of most of the way in which these discussions go.
And you think with these discussions, you've said you're worried about the Equalities Act. You can obviously change gender under the Recognition Act without it being modernised.
Yes.
And those people who change, would you have a problem with them in women-only spaces?
I've long advocated that we should preserve women-only spaces. that's been one of my central concerns, not least because when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I worked with many victims of sexual violence, domestic violence, and saw for myself just how important those spaces are. And that's why the approach I've taken to this is to say, look, for 99.9% of women, the issue is biological, and there have been great strides in terms of equality over many years, which we can't afford to lose, and we need to preserve things like safe spaces. It's my starting position. But there are a small number of people who don't identify with the gender into which they were born, who are very targeted, and we need to respect that as well. And that's why the Gender Recognition Act was passed. It needs to be modernised because I think there are indignities in the process, and that's why we're consulting and discussing what that modernisation should look like.
I just want to talk to you about health, and you've talked about the need for self-referral. And I lived in France. Happens all the time. If your kids are ill, you go and see a paediatrician. If there's a gynecological problem, you go and see a gynecologist. If there's and you talked about back specialists, and all of that makes absolute sense. Do you then need fewer GPs? Because you're not going to have the same triage system. And so rather than Britain having not enough GPs, might we have too many under a Keir Starmer reformed health service?
No, what you've got at the moment is not enough GPs, and they're massively overworked and overburdened. So we need to lift that burden. I mean, what we've said about self-referral is important because there are clear examples where individuals could self-refer, be signposted more quickly to where they need to go, and that would reduce the pressure on our GPs. But it's only one example of a wider argument that we are making, which is that we know the NHS is not just on its knees, it's on its face, it needs more resource, but resource on its own, more investment on its own won't be enough. We need to reform the NHS. We're all living longer. That's a brilliant thing. But it means we need a preventative model, an intervention model, earlier intervention model.
So why not embrace some of the ideas that are in Ireland, that are in France, of having an insurance model as well? That you have the basic free at the source of, point of going to a hospital or whatever, but that you pay a bit extra on insurance to top up the service.
Because we believe in free at the point of use. But, the reform argument always goes down the route of, well, what does that mean for the private sector? Does it mean insurance? And we're missing out on a huge discussion about prevention, about technology, about the way that our health service could be used within our communities. One of the things I'm very keen on is mental health hubs in our communities, which would massively reduce the burden on GPs and others. And so I'm slightly frustrated that every time we talk about reform of the NHS, the only question is, what about insurance? What about the private sector? Now, we've been clear that in terms of getting rid of the waiting lists, then we should more effectively use the private sector. So I don't have a hang-up in relation to that, but reform for me is much greater than that. This is about reforming the health service, but I ran a public service for 5 years, the Crown Prosecution Service, and I've long believed in reform. We had to reform it when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, because otherwise you put more money in, you'll get a slightly better output, but you'll never materially change your output. And I think that, particularly with the health service, the case for reform is overwhelming. I think the Labour Party is uniquely placed to not only make the argument, but carry out the reform.
OK, so while we're talking about reform, let me take you to your former life as Director of Public Prosecution. It seems pretty clear to a lot of women in this country now, the Met Police is broken. We're looking at people who have worked in the force as rapists for 18 years. Yeah. And there's 1,000 cases of sexual offences and domestic violence involving, we think, up to 1,000 officers. I mean, when you look at that, Keir, do you just say, this is broken, we need to start again?
It absolutely is fundamental review. The Carrot case is just shocking, jaw-droppingly shocking. But it's obviously not a single case on its own. There are other examples, many of which we've seen in the last few years
that aren't being spotted. That people are carrying on their jobs.
Yeah, there needs to fund root and branch review. cultural change, because this is not just the perpetrators, it's those that have allowed this to happen, moved them around, not taken action when they should have done. It needs root and branch
But you've got
review.
this new head, haven't you? You've got Mark Rowley,
Mark
you've got
Rowley,
a
yeah.
new person in the job. You know, we kind of hear those phrases, root and branch reform and cultural change. I'm just like, you know what it's like in Northern Ireland to take a police force right back, to,
Yeah.
raise it to the ground and start again, essentially. Do we need to do that with the Met Police?
Well, it may be that root and branch includes part of that. I mean, with the police service in Northern Ireland, obviously I worked with them for 5 years of my life over in Northern Ireland. That was root and branch. That was stripping it down. It was also very important that it was called the Police Service of Northern Ireland, because it changed the way in which the force was looking. It was a service to the public, not a police force.
Change the name? I mean,
exactly.
is that what you're
Well,
saying?
you could. I mean, if changing the name signals a change, then perhaps. But it was very important to what we were trying to achieve in Northern Ireland, that it was the police service
So
of
the
Northern Ireland.
Metropolitan Police, it could change. There could be a different name for it, because that would signify to a lot of people.
Well, the change means nothing unless the cultural change goes with it.
But the change that Emily was talking about, and the way so many women feel about the Metropolitan Police in particular.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it justifies that.
I think it's root and branch. It no stone unturned. The sort of cultural change that the PSNI went through, and to turn it inside out. Cultural change is the hardest. You can change the rules,
But Keir,
you can change
on a
the
personal
people,
level,
but cultural change is very, very difficult. Strong leadership is needed.
If your daughter was lost late at night, would you tell her to go and find or ask advice from a serving Met Police officer?
Yes, I would.
A man?
Yes, I would. And I think it's really important that we say that. I understand the concerns that many people, might have about that, but yes, I would. But, do we need to strip it down and look again? Yeah.
As the mother of Sarah Everard says, every day at the same time that her daughter was killed, she replays, don't get into that car, don't get into that car. I mean, how many women now are thinking about those moments and thinking, this is about not having any trust in the service that is literally there to support and protect us?
Yeah, which is completely understandable, and high levels of anxiety. But if it was my daughter, I still would say, go, if there's a police officer there, go and find him if it is a him. Obviously, a slightly different consideration if it's a her. But yes, I would say that.
So with respect to the Met, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You're saying there needs to be root and branch reform. There needs to be a much stronger management. It needs to rebuild trust, and maybe it does need to change its name.
Well, then yes to all of that. The name change on its own is meaningless. The reason the police service of Northern Ireland worked was because they were bringing through new officers, they were changing the ethos, they were changing the accountability, the policies, and the leadership. It needs very, very strong leadership to carry through cultural change. Cultural change is the hardest of all.
Keir, we're going to metaphorically take off our ties
Very
at
good.
this point.
We're not wearing any ties.
We're not wearing ties. You can take off your jacket if you want. I was quite struck last week with you saying, you told our former colleague Laura Kunsberg that you hadn't actually dreamt of being Prime Minister. And we know that there are others who have dreamt all their life of being, let's say, world king. So I want to know the moment that you suddenly think, oh, hang on, I could do that job. I mean, is it about having bad role models? Is it about seeing other people fail that makes you think, oh, I could be doing this better? Or was it, what is it?
No, I mean, let me just explain that. Some people have this sort of thing at school where they say, I'm going to be Prime Minister or something. I never had that. I have reflected on why that is, and it's one of the things I say when I go into schools, because I came up from a working class background, and my dad was a toolmaker, worked in a factory, my mum was a nurse. And somewhere in my head, there was something that said that people like me didn't go into politics, didn't become even MPs, let alone Prime Ministers. And I've spoken in a number of speeches about the sort of ordinary hope that working class people have of a decent job, a secure income, somewhere, a place you can buy of your own, etc. And I was in that zone. I thought people like me don't do things like that. What I say to schools when I go in now is, if that's a block in your head, get it out of your head, because it's probably one of the single biggest inhibitors. Then, I obviously did other things in my life. I was a lawyer, worked in Northern Ireland, was the Director of Public Prosecutions, and took a decision late in life to come into politics because I wanted to change things. I was frustrated that things that needed to change to improve our country and the lives of millions of people and communities weren't happening and were incapable of happening. I couldn't pull any more levers unless I came into Parliament to try and change all that. Then the frustration of opposition. But I didn't come in thinking, well, one day I'll lead the Labour Party. But after, as we go into 2019 and after 2019, we're at a existential moment almost for the Labour Party. We've just lost the worst election since 1935. People are seriously considering whether this party can ever be fit to serve again. And that drove me into leadership of the Labour Party.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in a second. What did the lad, Keir Starmer, want to be?
Oh, initially a footballer, but then not good enough for that. I toyed with, do I go into politics, somehow? And it was my parents who basically steered me and said, this is a very working class thing. You need a decent job.
Get a profession.
Get a decent job, get yourself a good living. You need to go and study law. Now, I'd never met a lawyer. I didn't really know what lawyers did, but steered, taken by the shoulders by my parents, I arrived at Leeds University to study law and then spent however many years after that as a lawyer. Yeah. I'm sort of purpose-driven, if you like, and serious about it. I'd actually, people say, well, where's the passion? There's a huge passion about the change we need to bring about, a huge passion about understanding what is it that we need to do. The reason I'm here is because I'm passionate about our country. I want to send a statement about what the incoming Labour government will do. That's a serious thing to do. It's also a passionate thing to do. I want our country to be, looked on, in the way it was, in very high regard. I want it to be a world leader. I think we've got absolute brilliance in our country, and I want to turn that around. And that's a different kind of passion. The passion that is there, but doesn't impress me, and I've seen it so many times, is where somebody passionately describes a problem, and you've got people who articulate, look at this, it's absolutely outrageous. Look at that, it's outrageous. Whoa, that's terrible, that's terrible. What a fantastic speech you just made about how terrible that is. Fine, great. Why don't you just fix it?
We should explain that Keir Starmer was actually pointing at his water cup at this point. We're all trying to fixate on the water cup.
Fixate on the water cup.
You are a busy man, and we're going to let you go. You've got a lot to do, but we'll end on a quick fire, because obviously we wouldn't be a podcast without a quick fire. So let us just ask you quickly. You have to choose now between Davos or Westminster.
Davos.
Why?
Because Westminster is too constrained, and it's closed, and we're not having meaning. Once you get out of Westminster, whether it's Davos or anywhere else, you actually engage with people that you can see working with in the future. Westminster is just a tribal shouting place.
You're an Arsenal fan. I'm going to give you the names of two die-hard Arsenal fans, and you've got to choose who you'd rather sit next to. Piers Morgan or Jeremy Corbyn?
Piers Morgan.
That was quick.
That was quick. That was very quick. Yeah.
Guacamole or mushy peas?
Mushy peas.
And do your kids think, oh God, I just wish he was home out of this politics?
And we looked at Jacinda Ardern, who stepped down, saying she's run out of gas in the tank,
and she wants to be there.
Is there a moment where you understand how much politics takes out of people?
Yeah, I mean, that is a serious point. Obviously, we've got a 14-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl, and it hugely impacts on them. And I'm sure there's a lot of them that wishes I wasn't doing what I'm doing. It manifests in different ways. If there's loads of press outside the house, that we haven't got much of a front garden, and for our daughter, she really, really dislikes that. But the way we've dealt with it as a family is a sort of rule that when I walk through the front door, I'm dad. I'm not leader of the Labour Party. I'm not leader of the opposition. And the good thing about the kids is it's a great leveller. They bring me down to earth. And I'll give you just two examples of that. So our daughter asked me one morning, what time are you in tonight? What time are you coming back? And I said, I'm doing a fundraising dinner. She said, no. I said, I'm going to a fundraising dinner. What's that? It's a dinner where people pay to hear someone speak. And she said, well, who's speaking? I am. And then she said, with all the sort of innocence, I suppose, of a young girl. Why on earth would anyone pay to hear you speak? It was like a car crash moment because you knew it was coming.
And that was the beginning of your speech.
Then with our boy the other day, so we had the Spectator Awards, and I got Politician of the Year, and it was a framed award. And I took it back, walked in, and our boy is watching television. He's 14. Takes it from me almost without looking up, looks at it. Pass it back, says, "How did you blag that then?" And carries on watching the TV. So,
do they want you to become Prime Minister?
I think they do. But if you ask them a different question, which is, would you rather none of this was happening? I think they might say yes. I think they would say yes.
Keir Starmer, thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.